And, Micah is a fascinating book. It's not one that we study a lot. There are a few verses that we are familiar with, but it's not a book that at least I've spent a lot of time into. But I really find it very fascinating when we stop to look at it. So when we look at the book of Micah, we're going to be looking at what are the divine tribunal. And so as we look at this, I want to think of a courtroom scene. As we think about what takes place in a court, it's filled with immense suspense. You think someone has been accused, and the question is, are they innocent or are they guilty? There's a defense attorney that's been defending the accused. There's prosecuting attorney or attorneys that are trying to show the guilt of the one that is accused. At least this would be in a criminal trial. And you can imagine as the jury is given its final directions and sent into the deliberating room, nobody knows how long the jury will be out. Will it be a matter of minutes, or will it be a matter of hours or even days? And as the jury returns and the spokesman stands up, you can cut the air from the suspense in the room. Now that's an earthly tribunal, and there have been many people that may have been sentenced in an earthly tribunal, but who have been set free by Jesus and will live for eternity. But what about a divine tribunal? How much more suspense there must be in that divine tribunal. And when we look at the book of Micah, I believe what we see is where God calls his people to judgment. Now, the book of Micah, when we look at it, is 7 chapters long, not a very long book, one of the longer of the minor prophets, I guess, but not a long book nonetheless. Basically, all that we know about Micah in Micah chapter 1, verse 1. Let's turn and read there. Micah chapter 1 and verse 1. Micah, in the first verse, the introduction, gives us our background information. Micah 1:1. The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. We know that Micah lived around the time, obviously, that these kings were reigning: Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now, Jotham was a fairly good king. Ahaz was about as bad as you get. And Hezekiah was one of the best kings. And prophesying in a time when there's a good king, things go really bad, and then things become better again. We don't see that interplay so much when we look at the book of Micah, but we know that that is what is going on. And Micah, because he mentions these kings of Judah, is prophesying primarily to the people of Judah, or the southern kingdom. It's in the final days. In just a few years, Israel is dependent. Judah doesn't have a much longer before it becomes a part of the Babylonian captivity takes place. Now, what's interesting, Micah and Isaiah were contemporaries, overlap. But it seems when we read the book of Isaiah that Isaiah had royal connections, and he was prophesying specifically to Hezekiah and people in influence and authority, where it seems like Micah is dealing more with the common people. And Micah begins with this stern warning. Notice verse 2 of Micah chapter 1. Hear, all you peoples, listen, O earth, and all that is in it. Let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. The message begins, "Hear, all you people, listen, O earth and inhabitants thereof. Let the Lord be a witness against you." Micah begins with courtroom language. The Lord is presenting evidence in his divine tribunal, and God begins in the very first verse of the message, at least, of the book of Micah, begins by presenting the evidence against his professed people. And it says, "The Lord from his holy temple." It tells us where this divine tribunal is taking place. Where is this tribunal taking place? Sanctuary of God in heaven, right? So there's a divine tribunal taking place. God is looking down from the courtroom, and he lays out the evidence. His people are what they've been doing. And notice here, we read in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. "Woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds." What are they doing here? It says they're working out evil on their beds. They're lying awake at night and considering how they can perform or practice evil. It continues what this is. "At morning light they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence, also houses, and seize them. So they oppress a man and his house, a man and his..." What does it say they're doing here? They're coveting fields and they're taking them, aren't they? They're considering, how can I get that field? How can I oppress the poor? How can I, those that are in need, how can I deal with it? And then, by the way, does that still happen today? You know, not too far from where we live, there was what was called about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the Burt Lake Burnout. The Burt Lake Band of Indians had been granted a small, about 400-acre area that was theirs by treaty, both by the U.S. government and by the state of Michigan. But there was a real estate developer, and this real estate developer determined that that was valuable land that he wanted and claimed that they had not paid taxes, and so he then paid the back taxes and then got the sheriff of Sheboygan to come and drive them out. And so it was the Burt Lake burnout, and it drove them inland from the land. And it's never been restored. The land was taken. They were coveting the land that was not theirs and figured out some, quote, it wasn't legal, but found out a way for the authorities, it wasn't legal, but found out a way for the authorities, the local authorities at least, to condone it. Micah was 2,500 years ago. That was 100 years ago. But the same thing still happens, doesn't it? Legal loopholes are laying on their beds at night, seeing while they can do evil. And God says, you're doing it because it's in the power of your hand. Notice chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. "Then I said, Hear now, O heads of Jacob, and you rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? You," what does he say? "Hate good, evil." Then he continues and gives quite an analogy there of like placing people in a cauldron, stripping their skin and the flesh from their bones. But notice what it says. They hated good and loved what? Evil. God is laying out the evidence. He's making his witness against them here. He's presenting the evidence against his people. You are those that are marginalized. You are stealing from them. You are thinking how you can do it on your bed, and then you do it in the morning because it's in the power of your hands to do it. And then he says, you hate evil. Notice what he says next here in verse 11. Her heads judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for pay. Her prophets divine for money. Now, we'll read the rest of the verse, but stop there. What is the issue that he's pointing out here? Love of money, right? Which is similar to chapter 2, covetousness, isn't it? And so he says, look, your judges, they are judging for a bribe. Your priests, they're not teaching because it's a divine commission. They are teaching because of pay. Your prophets, they're not prophesying because God has spoken to them. They're prophesying for money. And then notice the last part of the verse. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No harm can come upon us. So here's the picture. The judges, the priests, the prophets are more concerned with money than with God. And yet they are assuring themselves and they're saying, look, God is with us. Nothing bad is going to happen to us. Is that self-deception? Will we ever be more concerned with money than God today? Now, obviously, we have to work. We have to live in a world. We need money. I'm not saying anything against that. We recognize that. But it can become a problem when that comes before our obligation and our affection to God. And the most dangerous thing about it was, oh, we're prophesying, we're teaching, we're judging, but God is with us. No evil is going to come upon us. They were unjustly oppressing others. They were loving evil and hating good. And they were falsely deceived that they were walking with God when in reality they were not. God lays out the evidence from his judgment scene in heaven, the temple of God in heaven, the sanctuary in heaven. God lays out the evidence. Now, when God lays out the evidence, you can't argue against it. Normally in a court case here, evidence is presented and the evidence by the defense is interpreted one way and the evidence by the prosecution is interpreted another way. And sometimes you don't even know if it's legitimate evidence or not. I read an account of a lady, tragically, when she was 22 years of college and someone broke into her apartment and she was raped. In her mind, she thought, I am going to remember my accuser here, the perpetrator of this, so that I can try to identify him and bring him to justice. And she did. She tried to remember that face, and then as they began to investigate pictures of different individuals before her, and she clearly picked out one. And then they saw the person in person. I don't know if it was in the court or whenever. The same one that she had seen in the picture. 10 years later, and that man was sitting on death row. 10 years later, given the DNA evidence, and it was not him. He was released from prison. The DNA matched someone else that had died in prison. Obviously died in prison. Committed a number of crimes in between that crime and when he was eventually caught. And this lady and this man that she thought that's who it was. It was not that she was get him or anything like that. It's just that's who she thought it was. But the mind can play tricks on you. And they go about now and they actually will speak and promote about the danger of relying only on facial recognition. There was another man I read about, and this happened in Detroit. He was driving home from work, and his wife called him and said, "The police say you better turn yourself in." He's like, there must be some mistake. He pulled into his house, and all of a sudden, surrounded by police cars. His children watched as he was handcuffed and taken to jail. And as he's being interrogated, the evidence that they had was some facial recognition from a computer. And he holds it up and he says, "Do you think that's me? Look at my face. Is that me?" And he said, one of the investigators said, "Well, I guess the computer got it wrong." He said, "Does that mean I can go free?" "No, not yet." He ended up spending 30 hours in jail because a grainy picture on a security camera had been flagged to him off of his driver's license, and he had no idea anything about it, what was going on at all. Evidence in this world can go awry sometimes. I'm not saying it always does. I think that we have a good justice system. I'm not saying that that's majority or anything, but it's a fact that evidence can be mistaken